Good morning and welcome to this webinar, Cold Morning, here in Stockholm. My name is Shahid Hanif. I'm the Head of Health Data and Outcomes at the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry, and I'm the Work Package 3 lead on communication and coordination of the Big Data for Better Outcomes project and the coordination and support action. Today, this webinar is on an HTA perspective on the acceptability of real-world evidence and methods to enhance its use. And I'm joined here by a panel which I'll introduce, which includes Nicholas Hedberg, who's the Chief Pharmacist from TLV, and Per Johansson, who's the Professor of Statistics at Uppsala University, Jan Liljemark, who's a Professor of Pharmacotherapy at SBU, the Swedish Agency for Health Technology Assessment and the Assessment of Social Services, as well as here at TLV. And then Wim Gutsch, who's the Special Advisor at the HTA, the Dutch National Healthcare Institute Zin. So welcome everyone. And to begin with, I just want to give a couple of reminders. If you're having problems with your connection, you can switch between the phone and also the computer audio. We do intend to have about at least 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes for question and answers. If you do have any question and answers, please begin to just put them into the question box, and we'll see them coming through, and we'll get a sense of how much time we need to proportion to answer some of those questions. To begin with, I just wanted to give some context of where this webinar is coming from. With this webinar as part of the IMI initiative called Big Data for Better Outcomes, and we're essentially I want to describe just what the program is about for those people who are unaware. The program is essentially, its mission is to improve health outcomes in healthcare systems in Europe by maximizing the potential of big data. And there are four key enablers to the program as a whole. The firstly is around designing a set of standard outcomes and demonstrating value. The second is around increasing access to high quality outcomes data. The third around using data to improve value of healthcare delivery and increasing patient engagement through digital solutions. Presently, there are 4 disease-specific projects within Alzheimer's disease, hematological malignancies, cardiovascular disease, and prostate cancer, and another initiative which has just started in the last week, the European Health Data and Evidence Network, as well as this project, the Coordination and Support Action, form the coordinating projects. If you want some more information about this initiative, you can visit the website bd4bo.eu, and also we're on Twitter as well at the BD4BO handle. So to begin with, I think just to outline, we'll be going through a couple of presentations and case studies. So I'll begin with Per Johansson. If you can begin with your case study, and we'll move from there.
Yes. Thank you so much. We talk about causal inference and estimates. So estimate is simply what we would like to know about, sort of what we would like to estimate. So in order to do this, many times, what we do is we think about randomized the allocation of treatment. That is the randomized controlled trial. And this has been seen as the gold standard for causal inference. The crux with the randomized controlled trials on humans is that people are conscious. That is, we are not like rats, or we are not objects. And this makes it not possible to empirically identify estimate of interest if we are not blinding the treatment. That is, we have a lot of biases if we are not blinding. We have bolt-on effect, substitution bias, things that make it not possible to find an unbiased estimator. So we need to double blind the experiment. We need to blind the people that are treated, and we need also to blind the people that are giving the treatment. Even triple blind randomized controlled trials is needed sometimes, especially we know that from, for instance, giving AIDS medicine in the 80s, where people who were given AIDS medicine, that was a very severe disease. So this meant that people wanted to get the active treatment and not sort of the placebo. So it was a sort of close community. So people gathered around this, and then they shared the drugs So the double blinding need not even to work. Triple blinding is really that also the investigator can be fooled into cheating, so affected by knowing which is the active drug and which is the placebo. Due to informed consent, a double-blind randomized control trial identifies only the sample average treatment effect against the placebo. And this is not really what we would like to know about in real world. We would like to know about the effect of the drug in a clinical practice, and this is what is known as the population average treatment effect. Furthermore, in many situations, we cannot give blinded placebo. We cannot give it when we do a heart transplant, for instance, or if we have a KBT treatment. So the alternative or complement to double-blind trials, randomized trials, is observational studies. The crux is again that individuals are conscious. This means that the allocation of treatment is a decision based on the outcome of the study, and that individuals are optimizing on the effect. This means that bad health, here denoted as Y0, are the reason for a medical treatment, for instance, cognitive behavioral therapy, and that those that are giving this treatment are optimizing on the treatment effect. It is the difference between the outcome on the treatment and the outcome on the non-treatment. So this means that all observational studies must be design-based. So what is a design-based study? A design-based study is that we need to have an understanding and modeling of the allocation of treatment. Just like in a randomized control trial, we remove all sort of things by randomizing. The allocation is randomized. So the central part in all causal studies is the allocation process. And this is the Rubin causal model that he put up in the 70s. Understanding the allocation process is very central. If possible, use variation in the allocation that can be believed to be beyond the control of the individuals involved in the allocation. In our case, it would be the doctors and or patients for the treatment allocation. These kind of, if it's possible, we can find exogenous variation, sort of, in institutional rules, for instance, different how drugs are distributed in different parts of the country. We can use weather, we can use geography, that is called natural experiment. And these kind of estimators or designs are called difference in difference designs, regression discontinuity designs, IV, etc. There are many options. Variation may also be created by researchers or decision makers by having something called an encouragement design. This is sort of sending out information about treatment, encourage people to be treated rather than to randomize the treatment per se. Then you can estimate things using instrumental variables approaches to stage squares and things. If you have a design-based study, then this is denoted as a quasi-experimental study. So in all studies, I think we cannot, even if we have big data, we cannot use machine learning principles. We need to understand the allocation mechanism. At the moment, I'm doing something for the TLV, Swedish HTA, where we are really trying to understand why are people giving the drug that they have been giving. We have done qualitative work, discussing with doctors why they prescribe the certain drugs, how they do it. We have also been in contact with the people patients, asking them about sort of their needs and what they are thinking about this kind of drugs. We have gone through institutional rules, whether they differ across the country. So that is the first thing we have been doing. Then one should try to model the allocation without having access to the outcomes. So don't have access to the outcomes. Here you can use machine based on the understanding of the allocation mechanism. You can basically use machine learning techniques to remove some of the covariates if you have a lot of covariates. After that, you should see that the observed covariates should be balanced, as in a randomized controlled trial. See that you get really the same balance as you would have get in a randomized controlled trial. You should see that you have common support, and with common support, it means that treated and controls have the same covariates. There should be, after you have the design, there should be an agreement by stakeholders on the design. After that, you add outcomes and estimate the agreed upon estimates. And then after that, one should conduct sensitivity analysis. That means sensitivity to unobserved confounding.
Thank you very much, Per. Thanks very much for giving some perspectives on some of the issues around decision making, both in the real world and some of the challenges that, in the sense, that people are facing. We're now going to move on to a couple of case studies, and initially begin with Jan Lillemore, who's going to give an outline of the case study.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I have the first slide,
yep,
please? This is a project which is supported by the Swedish government in a collaboration between the TLB, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Board, and the county of Västra Götaland, western part of Sweden. The problem we have is, not the problem, the basic is that we have value-based pricing for drugs in Sweden, and value-based is based on health economic evaluation, which is based on RCT data. The question we ask ourselves is, of course, do we get bang for the buck? Is the value of the treatment in the real world as good as it seems to be from RCT data? If it's actually lower, the value in the real world, we are probably sub-optimizing the use of our resources. But it might be just the other way, that the value is actually higher in the real world, or at least higher than we anticipate. And then we are also sub-optimizing our resources because we are not using the drugs we should be using. And the problem basically is a lack of information. Therefore, we want to try to compare data from RCT and real world or clinical praxis. We have a general population with a disease, for example, diabetes, and then we have a target population. The target population, those patients whom we want to treat with a new drug. And from that population, when we make an RCT, we draw a sample according to inclusion and exclusion criteria. And those patients are quite similar in the sample. While patients from clinical practice or the target population in real world might differ quite substantially in characteristics. And the situation is also in a randomized trial, the control and the treated group should be similar, while in clinical practice they might differ quite substantially. So we have two populations here, the target population and the RCT population. I think that's one. And we can take a sample or find individuals from the RCT and match them with similar individuals. This is statistical individuals from the target population, make a match, and then we can figure out how common are these different individuals in the two populations. For example, the green guys are quite common in the RCT, while the black guys are more common in the target population. So we make a weighting. So the green guys will have a lower weight than the black guys, or vice versa. And for this, we make propensity scores based on the probability of the patient in the target population actually could have been a patient in the RCT. All the drugs in type 2 diabetes are prescribed, which means they are all gathered in the so-called National Drug Register. These new drugs in type 2 diabetes, they have mostly been used for a few years. There are some data from real world. We negotiated with the 4 companies. 2 of them participate in this project, that is AstraZeneca and Novo Nordisk. We made a new data set, based on patients in the National Diabetes Register, the Diagnosis Register, the National Drug Register, and some other registers, and pooling the data from all these registers. We made a new data set, and we compare that with the data set from the RCT studies. And we identify appropriate parameters and characteristics from the 2 data sets. We analyze all the data together from both these data sets on the SAS platform, and the reason for that we'll come back to. There are two possible analyses you can do. One is actually to predict the effect in real life before you have treated even a single patient. You can take data from the RCT and based on the differences in characteristics between the populations, you can predict how the patients will respond in real world. And you can also compare the effects, the actual effects from RCT and real world when you have the sufficient number of patients treated for sufficient length of time. So the RCT data we have from in one of the studies is actually a standard add-on treatment with metformin. Patients who are not well controlled on the metformin, and you add on either dapagliflozin or glyphosate. The outcome of the standard for diabetes, HbA1c, weight, and blood pressure. And the statistical model is, as I said, you have two populations that you compare. One is the RCT population and one from the National Diabetes Register. And you can make a weighted prediction, that's a W in the middle, from the result from the randomized trials to the patients in the target population. And in that target population, you can also compare by matching also the patients who are treated with dapagliflozin and the patients who are treated with the control treatment. These are the actual numbers and the results we have so far, but I'm not going to go through them because we don't have time for that, and they are also very preliminary and quite complicated to explain. So we go to the next slide. And the conclusions finally is that we have data available for a generalization of RCT data to the real-world population. It is, in other words, possible to operationalize inclusion and most of the exclusion criteria from the RCT. We have that data in the real world. However, some patients from the RCT could not be used because of there were no available. The informed consent made it impossible to use the patients for this project, and that's one take-home message to those of you who are from drug companies, that you should think about that when you write your informed consents, that you might want to use the data for some other purposes later on. Some types of data differs between the RCT and real world and are more difficult to compare, and it just takes some more work. The statistical methods cannot compensate for all the factors that differs between RCT and real world. For one thing, we measure HbA1c in the RCT because of its schedule to be done, while in real world we measure it because patients need to be measured for some reason. And the control patients in real world, they might be put on the treatment of other reasons than in real world, because one reason is because they have different weights. And we have some problem in Sweden, maybe you have in other countries too, with the law of access to public data, which makes it impossible to guarantee the secrecy of the data that we need from the companies. So that's why we use a SaaS platform for the analysis. However, this is quite cumbersome to work on, and the software is not really updated. There seems to be complicated decision procedures in the companies. That's probably something that can be worked on and improved, but it took a long time before we could get any data, a lot of negotiations. You cannot extrapolate data from patients who are represented in an RCT to patients who are not represented in the RCT. So the red guys in the real world populations, we just cannot say anything about the effect in those who were not represented in RCT. And finally, type 2 diabetes is a very common disease, but can these techniques be used and applied to more rare conditions and with other types of outcomes of the more soft type? We don't know that yet. That has to be tested separately.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was very interesting. Next, we're going to move on to another case study, which is going to be presented by Wim. So while the slides just launch up, Wim, over to you.
Thank you. I think that I more have a kind of policy perspective a little bit different from the first two presentations, but I think it links very well because some of the methodological issues which are discussed in the previous two presentations are also very relevant for the policy debate. I see my slides, so what I would like to do in like 5 to 10 minutes, just to say a little bit of words from a policy perspective. So why do we need patient registries in order to have real world evidence for HTA offensive benefit and actually taking approach? Well, what we see, I think that is our background, is that we face many new, very expensive medicines that come to the market. Subsequently, we have to deal as an HTA organization to actually advise our government on reimbursement, while we're still perceiving a lot of uncertainty on the effectiveness and the cost effectiveness. Moreover, I think that was also quite clearly addressed in the previous presentation, that we probably see that these patients are actually treated differently than they were actually treated in trials. So, for instance, in different lines of treatment or in different combinations. And just to give you a very recent example of something which we were involved in, is something about CAR-T, which is a new innovative therapy. However, we felt, well, we have data from clinical trials, but what would you expect in real practice? And there we used data used from the United States to see that these CAR treatments can be used in different lines of treatments. And then subsequently, you actually want to know what does this mean to their effectiveness in real life, and what kind of data then do you need to extrapolate those clinical data from an RCT or another type of study to our own real practice. And this is just an example to show that, because we have similar slides from also other products. And is this an issue? I think this is an issue which is shown by a study which was quite recently actually published by us on some of these products, which are called conditional market authorization products. And these products come to the market with a conditional market authorization, subsequently go out to HTA. You have to actually say, well, what do you think of it? And what you see in this kind of assessments, so we did that for these products and looked at different HTA organizations around Europe, for instance, NICE, HES, ICWIC, and our organization in the Netherlands, SSME, see that there's a quite, not quite often they get a positive, fully positive decision. So it means that a lot of these products are quite negatively assessed by HTA organizations, showing that we have these products on the market, but then there's a lot of uncertainty whether we should actually give them reimbursement, because there's a lot of uncertainty about effectiveness. And so there are rarely unrestricted positive recommendations. So that is, I think, if you want to actually have a little bit more speedy introduction of these products to the patients, you really have to take this into account, that this happened at HTA level. And so it doesn't actually has to deal with controlled or uncontrolled data, but we see it just in general. And we also discuss what can we do actually to make this process better. So we think efficient collaboration before the studies start on what kind of information we want, for instance, early dialogues might help. But most prominently, I think we then subsequently, do we actually need additional data collection after market authorization? And then these are actually what we call the patient registries. So what does that mean for our policy in the Netherlands? So if we think that we get a lot of these new products to the market, which we have doubts on their effectiveness, we probably need these additional data. So, and I think that most commonly these are patient registries to monitor expensive medicines. We can also use it for appropriate use later on for other expensive medicines, but especially for the CMA products, but also some of the orphan medical products. This is probably very prominent. And what we actually see in the Netherlands currently is that there is, of course, a lot of activity, for instance, by clinicians, by some of the registries we already have, but these are very shattered of the country and very diverse in quality and quantity. So even if there are registries around, quite often we are not sure whether we can actually use the data to monitor these products after they come to the market. And we have tried already in previous instances to actually do this for what we call conditional reimbursement or preference development. And we have actually shown that a lot of that data has until now very limited usefulness. for HTA and decision making. So the quality is not good enough, the quantity is not good enough. So there might be data, but actually it's not enough to make a good HTA and finally to actually give advice to our government. And therefore, we think that more coordination is needed to improve the use of these patient registries for HTA. So what we're currently in is that we have been asked by our Ministry of Health to actually take coordination on this patient registries. So actually the minister says, well, we want to actually move ahead and actually find a system in which we can actually not have this shattered and very different experience around the country. So what we would like to do is actually to focus on a number of aspects. For instance, on the standardization on which data should be collected everywhere, but also on what kind of methodology do you use if you have this data available. And I think, for instance, the presentation which was actually presented before is very interesting because it shows if you can compare data from a registry to a clinical trial, it may actually give you some insight on how data are. And we also have some experiences in which we actually saw that some of the registries provide data in which, if you select the patients which are totally comparable to the patients which were included in the clinical trials, the responses of these medicines are comparable. That might also be used to subsequently see, well, what do we think of the patients which are also treated but were not included in that clinical trial. But also what we think is very important, I don't know how it's in other countries, but in the Netherlands, a lot of different activities are being taken care of in terms of registering data for patients. It's not only like us, but also clinician organizations, quality organizations, healthcare insurance. So we see if we actually want such a standardized system, we cannot actually start totally something new again. So we have to find a way to decrease additional burden on data collection and actually go back to the electronic health records and find intelligent methods to analyze those data. And I think that is what we call going back to the data of the source. And I think that is something which is quite interesting, but we all know that the data at the source are sometimes not as good as we hope. So this is something which we really have to work on in the coming years. For us, it's also important, although we have been asked to be the coordinator of the process, it can only be done together with the stakeholders. So we actually are going to reinforce a kind of expert committee with patients, healthcare providers, registry holders, industry, and payers to actually bring this program forward. And should always also be linked to other activities. Again, because we don't want to duplicate what is already being going on. So one of the issues which we currently debated, and I think maybe also discussed over here, is, well, how do we ensure what we do in the Netherlands is in some way also linked to what is going on in other European countries? I think that the issue which we struggle with, for instance, with some of these very rare diseases for which we have conditional market authorization, a number of patients are really low in the Netherlands. So we need to find a way in how we can actually bring registry data from different countries together. And I think that up till now there is a lot of activity, but also that is very shattered. And I think that a few of these big data experiences might help actually to see how you can actually link those data for different countries together. But I think still this is still something which needs a lot of work. Another thing is what we discussed in the Netherlands: should participation in patient registries be mandatory? Actually, if you talk about a solidarity-based healthcare system, you're thinking that receiving a very expensive treatment is a right. So actually giving data for improving therapy should be a public duty. This is something which we're currently discussing. If actually people are included actually and get the treatment, they should actually give those data. Of course, we need to have consent, but normally I think there might be a reason actually to link a payment to actually providing data. Then is there a question of how are you going to fund this kind of governance, this kind of registries? And there are all kind of different models available. You have public funding of registries. You have private funding, for instance, companies fund registries because sometimes they also have an obligation to do so. For instance, as part of the conditional market authorization, they have to do some registries. And you have public-private funding system. They have all their pros and cons, but for instance, for private, we have learned that if they're totally owned by the company, sometimes the issue, especially you have a different treatment, one indication, that's not so actually easy to actually bring those data together. So we have to think very carefully how we can ensure that we, at some moment, because we were focused on disease registries, we can bring all those data together. And one of the options which we're currently discussing is that maybe that we have a DRG system, in which also these drugs are included in the hospital, that we should maybe include a small fee for every treatment. And that could be used actually to fund the registry. And this is just an idea, but it might be an option because this fee probably will be still very limited compared to the prices of many. Finally, I think that is something we have with ethical and technical issues. Ideally, I think there is a program in the Netherlands in which we actually want to have the patient in the center of all this. So the patient should be the holder of all the data, but how subsequently can we then ensure that this data can also quickly be used in the patient registries for these products? And how subsequently do we guarantee linkage of data? For instance, we might have all the data from the hospitals, but sometimes they are not linked to pharmacy data or to GP data. So how are we going to do that? And then subsequently, the technical question will be, are we going to actually work to central databases in which we are going to collect all this data together, which is probably not very feasible, or use federated databases in which you use actually software algorithms, like for instance, SAS algorithms, to actually bring all those data together. So this is a little bit my perspective on patient registries and using real-world data for actually assessing the effectiveness of these types of products.
So I would like to, at this point, encourage you to post some questions just in the question bar. And while you do, I'm going to introduce and ask Nicholas to also give his perspective from a payer perspective on some of the challenges.
Thank you very much, Shahid. From where I come, I must agree to almost everything that has been said from previous, and of course we recognize lots of this from our decision-making perspective after TLV. Though I would briefly like to start in the other end, and Wim pointed out the need for coordination and so on. So I want to emphasize that this is an important topic for a lot of people and agencies with different tasks. And especially then taken up by, I would like to say, taken up by UNETA, where a full work package 5, is designated to evidence generation. In work package 5B, from which I think some partners are also listening, I would like to say that we work very, very intensely with both registry quality tool and some pilots, both together with the EMA and among UNETA partners. So this is an important topic for a lot of people, and IMI is another example where we work together. But then briefly, why is TLV into this as the pricing and reimbursement agency? Well, we realize that we need to make decisions where we do lack data even today, and we realize that's going to be even worse in the future. We need information, want to know things that cannot be answered through the methods and study designs we have been used to putting as ground for our decision making. And that makes us want to exploring and developing tools and methods in terms of data, how to talk about quality of data, how to talk about access of data. We need to deepen our knowledge about methods. When needed, perhaps try to develop new ones, because we think, we realize the need for methods, but the ones present will not do the job for us. We need to do that both on theoretical level and back to basic infrastructure, I would say. And we have come to the conclusion then, and also had assignments from the government to do this in pilots. And Per and John they have both been talking about tasks they do on behalf of us. So we're trying to explore possibilities now in a quite broad sense. Though I must admit, as was also mentioned here before, we also still don't know in detail how are we going to make decisions based on this new kind of knowledge? When are we going to make or even change the decisions based on this kind of knowledge? And how much is it going to influence our decision making? That needs still to be answered, but we know that. We know it is coming, and we need to be as prepared as possible for that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And I think your point at the end very much is about how are we going to be prepared really for the future when it comes to this, in terms of whether it's kind of ensuring that we have the right kind of access of data, whether we have the right kind of infrastructure, the methods which are in place as well. So kind of, I guess initially I'll just start with a question for Jan really, is, you know, you've outlined propensity scoring. I mean, what other types of methods do you see that are potentially going to be useful in the future to address some of the issues around evidence generation and the use of some of that evidence in decision making?
Yeah, well, the methods we are using currently certainly has its limitations, but I still believe, and I believe maybe more in the type of prediction of the value you're going to see in real world, and that is, I think, more useful because when you are in a negotiation between the payers and company, it would really be very good to have a better prediction of what you can expect in real world. While when you follow up a few years later, you have to be very certain if you're going to withdraw some drug from the market to make a new negotiation that you have very firm data, and then again you have to wait several years before you get that kind of data. So I think the way of prediction of real world effects is quite nice and useful.
And when, from your perspective, from a policy angle, what I guess are the initiatives, the coordination type of initiatives that you're seeing, or even some of the more local initiatives which are taking place at the moment, which are kind of going to be instrumental really going forward, where, you know, the mechanism for both shared learning as well as kind of developing this coordination at a European is certainly one of the ambitions of the BD4BO initiative as a whole, is how to work across and leverage this engagement across Europe as a whole.
Yeah, I think there are a number of things going on. I think that Niklas already referred to some of the IMI initiatives. And I think that some of the IMI big data initiatives are I think, very important to see what kind of data sources there are around Europe, in which extent these data sources are usable, can be combined, and actually be used for decision making on different levels. So I think that is a very worthwhile endeavor, because I always also think that it's worthwhile not to only have HTA together, but also have the other stakeholders in the room. So this should be a common effort. Another example of that is a project which we are involved, is called the IMI Get Real, which is also a lot of methodology and actually how are you going to use those data. Just to give you an example, within this IMI Get Real initiative, some methods have been worked out. One about using pragmatic clinical trials for decision making, and another one about actually linking different data together using network meta-analysis. And it's even about linking, for instance, ICT and real world data together. And now we are in the stage actually seeing how can we implement this on a national level. For instance, our assessors, can they actually use those tools? And I think that the next stage would be, in terms of HTA, that this also has to be linked to what is being done in the collaboration. And there's work going on then on that issue, also together with EMA, on what kind of patient registries do we want, and we qualify those, and subsequently what can we do with those data. So there should be a link between those projects and some of the UNETA projects, and there might be also other projects. Myself, together with some others, also with involvement from NICE and TLV, are starting a New Horizon 2020 projects, in which we want to see how can this data actually be used to have more tailored HTA for more personalized. But this is, I think, still in a very early phase of development. Finally, I think it's also important on the national level that you ensure that there is a broad base of support for these kind of activities. As I said in my presentation, I'm sometimes a little bit worried about the burden of registration, and we see that in the Netherlands. There's a lot of being asked of physicians, of nurses, and in some moment they don't have any time anymore to actually do what we call the real work. But we have to ensure that we find ways to actually collect those data, which can be used for different purposes, which could be used for the politician, could be used for HTA assessments too. And there's a real challenge. So I think that we also have to see how we can organize that these data from the source, from the health records, could be actually used better.
Okay. And from your perspective in statistical angles, you've outlined, I guess, some of the issues in terms of kind of both the research plan, having the right kind of data. What do you see going forward as going to be a challenge from a statistical angle in terms of getting that evidence?
I mean, it's a really interesting discussion about the data and the data quality, because that's essential, of course. My perspective is about identification. So I think one could do what agency can do is also create variation in the allocation in different ways. To create a natural experiment, if there is some drug that is really important, we can change, for instance, subsidies in different regions to create differences in allocation of the drug by sort of, if it's possible. So if you change the subsidies to different county councils in Sweden, for instance, that will change differences in prescribing medicine, and that's it's a variation that you can use to estimate the effect of this. That's one way of doing it. Another way is to do information campaigns to different county councils, for instance. You can create also variation that you later on can use to get credible estimates of something. And I think it's very interesting to compare estimates between randomized controlled trials and observational studies, but one should be aware of that we are really estimating two different types of parameters. So having said that, I mean, it's not obvious that you get the same both estimates could be causal estimates, even though they are a little bit different. So it's a little bit tricky also to compare estimates from randomized controlled trial, because they are estimating the sample average treatment effect for a very specific sample and placebo in an experimental studies. And we know that people are affected by taking part in experiments. In real world, you are not affected in the same way. So it is a little bit tricky. But with sensitivity analysis and placebo test and research design, I think observational studies, I mean, read what Nancy Cartwright wrote, for instance, about what you can learn from real-world evidence. I think sometimes you can learn more than if you do a randomized controlled trial, sometimes. But the best is, of course, if we have an understanding of what is the variation in treatment that we observe in data. So you can see, I mean, in the study that we are doing, we can see large variation in treatment assignment of the medicine that we get across the country. Why is that? Why is that? Is it just because there are health differences? No, I don't think so. It's something else. And this means that you have a variation that you can take into consideration when you estimate the effect. So understanding the allocation and the difference in the allocations is the essential thing for causal influence.
Okay. Thanks very much. Just to go through some of the questions. So yeah, the slides and the recording will end up going onto the BD4BO website in the next couple of weeks. A question, I guess, for Yannick is, can we use this technique in value-based pricing for rare disease treatments?
I think it will be very difficult, because in rare diseases, for one thing, you quite seldom have randomized trial data. And the other is, of course, that there are few patients, and you need a certain number of patients to be able to do this statistical analysis with some confidence. So I don't think we can solve the problem with pricing of rare diseases with these techniques.
Okay. And on the next question on the mandatory and public duty, which we highlighted, how about data coming from out-of-pocket treatments? Anyone have a view on that?
I haven't really thought about it that deeply, but I think it will be an interesting task to define who's owning those data, how to define them more in a legal way. From a methodological point of view, I don't think it matters. It's rather the opposite. It might, in some circumstances, enhance the chance to do a natural experience, as Per was talking about. But you need to look at them with that awareness, I think.
And the next question, when the trial is single-arm, non-comparative, how can real-world evidence be used to estimate a relative treatment effect for HTA? I think, Jan, this might be for you.
Well, what we're doing is actually based on the fact that there is a control arm. So I'm not sure really. Maybe Per has some ideas about how to use single arm data.
No, I would not believe in that, but it's used. I know.
We don't like single arm trials.
No, it's not a trial.
Okay, the next question from Mary Lawrence Lambert is the mention around. We didn't mention claims data or billing data. These have some limitations, but are already being used. Do you see any use of these from your perspective, from an HTA perspective? And
What kind of data was that?
Claims data. It's a kind of billing data. It's claims data, which are the data which is being asked for when in paying for medicines and so forth.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that's possible to use if you think about variation, sort of. So if the claims varies across sort of district or something like that, that's an evidence that there are. I mean, we are thinking about using this kind of price differences in our experiments. So price differences of these drugs, yes, that is useful.
Wayne, would you have a view on that?
Yeah, sometimes I hear parts of the questions, but I think it was about using claims data, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Well, I think claims data can help, but you have to be cautious in terms of what is actually being collected. In my organization, we have claims data, and these are claims data which come from health insurance. And they are, of course, collected with a certain purpose. And the purpose actually is to facilitate reimbursement. So it's very financially organized. Quite often also there is a kind of what we call a drug diagnosis related group. So it's divided. So, and we sometimes also know that that kind of information on there is not enough to have a clear insight on what actually happens to the patient, or what the exact diagnosis is for the patient. So this data can be of additional value sometimes, especially if you're interested to get some additional information on costs. But you have to be very careful. So in that sense, I think that you finally want to go back to the hospital or to the GP or to any other institute to get their basic data, and then in some way try to actually ensure that they are able to collect those data, at least in some way in standardized forms. Or in the other way, you have to actually develop tools which you can actually also use to actually interpret their free text, which is available in a lot of these electronic health records. I think these tools are becoming, of course, more and more developed. So we also see already some examples which show actually quite good results. But claims data can help, but I think that it's certainly not in the Netherlands itself. It would not be enough to do any studies.
The next question from Kate Betteridge. Again, Wim, this might be a question for you as well, or perhaps even. Can the panel expand on the complexities of conditional marketing authorizations in combination with real-world evidence to secure reimbursement? Can anything be done to speed access to medicines, for example, new innovative contracting arrangements?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because I think that on one hand, of course, you get new pharmaceuticals in, which are quite often not cheap. And on the other hand, we have a lot of uncertainty of these pharmaceuticals, because we're not quite sure how they work, how large the effect is, and which patients are mostly benefited by these drugs. So yes, so there might be reasons to actually say, well, in one hand, we want to collect additional data to get more insight on for which patient is the best. On the other hand, of course, you say, well, we don't want to pay a premium price for something which we still have a lot of doubts on, and therefore link that to certain price levels. I think that, for instance, one of my colleagues has actually suggested that we should actually start with quite a low price, and then based on what we actually see in practice, and especially for the patient for which it works, you could actually increase the price based on certain outcomes you define on forehand. But again, of course, we all know this is not an easy thing, because that relates to value-based healthcare. You have to get agreement on what kind of outcomes you're going to use, and what are you going to actually call significant improvement in that outcome. So ideally, I think that would be a nice concept, but practically it's still very difficult.
And I would say, I mean, the main reason to grant reimbursement in the restricted population or so and ask for real world data is not to have to wait. So the measures taken to speed up. Though I think it's worth to say also that the general impression is that among HTAs and payers, there is right now quite a large disappointment on the kind of data and the relevance and strength of the data that is coming up as a response to those claims. And then I think, as the second part of the question, that the combination of a demand for new data and a managed entry agreement somehow that states how both data of positive or negative character and a very long waiting time for no data, etc., shall be handled and reflected in the price. So I think I'm quite close to what Wim says.
I do think that technique that we discuss here today can help us to refine the use of historical data to compare with uncontrolled data. We're not there yet, but I'm quite convinced that we can do better in the future than we have done so far, and be able to make at least a reasonable estimate of effect in real life by using historical data. Especially in the cancer area where I used to work, where there are very few patients who are not treated with these new drugs once they're on them.
Thank you. Just a reminder here from Roger Gaspard that the EMA's Regulatory Science 2025 strategy is open for consultation until the first semester of 2019, and just to highlight to you all in a sense to provide some feedback into that, particularly in the context of this discussion. The next question I want to move on to, and I think we might just have time for a couple more, is around from Harold Gillensward, which is around the use of pragmatic randomized control trials, and can these be an option for good evidence in real life patients? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of doing things. It's still for a restricted population, sort of on sort of borderline cases, but I think it's a very good way to do it. But it's a very cheap way of getting evidence. There are many ways other ways of doing randomized controlled trials now that you can increase the efficiency also with a smaller set of individuals. There is a lot of things going on at the moment with designs in randomized controlled trials, and I'm involved in some of them. There is a lot of interesting things going on in the randomized controlled field, but also in the observational field with observational data.
Especially in a situation where we have a number of, for example, cancer drugs on the same indication that comes at the same time, and you're going to do comparative trials, and the randomized registered trial is quite good.
Yeah, I think this is like an encouragement design, as I talked about before. Instead of sort of having this on the fly, you can also influence the probability to be treated rather than directly.
The one other question which I want to come to is a question from Julie Mount, which is what should be the role of the market authorization holder in provision of real-world evidence post-launch when the HTA body feels there is high uncertainty? Nicholas, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can. I think that in the majority of cases, the main responsibility will lie with the market authorization holder, though this is a task we have to take up together with a large group of stakeholders. And I see we also had a question about the involvement of patient organizations and network, etc. I think we need to have, by a number of different reasons, from scientific and methodological down to economical and legal reasons, we have to have a very large number of stakeholders involved when we do some of these follow-up, and especially then from patients and practitioners and registry holders to companies. But I think either there will be an agency or a company that is responsible for the main outcome. That's my picture.
Wim, would you want to comment on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I'll follow up to what Niklas is saying. I think originally, especially if you're talking about the CMA project, the company already has a kind of task to actually collect data. And one of the things we sometimes worried about, and we discuss internally, that what can we do to not actually see that they have to collect data twice. So actually these are requirements which are necessary to collect data for the conditional market authorization. Can these data also be provided in a system which can also provide some data for a system for conditional reimbursement, for instance? I also think that we have to be careful to actually see how we are going to organize these registries and actually also ensure the durability of the registries. Because if it would be totally productly related and totally dependent on funding of a market authorization holder, it might be very ad hoc registries. And I think we didn't want to have ad hoc registries, but more permanent disease registries. So I think an example which we have is around melanoma registries, where actually a very comprehensive registry have built up with all the centers involved in the Netherlands. And there is a kind of contribution fee by the companies which actually have drugs for which they have to provide additional data. However, the system as such is independent and governed by physicians. And there is also some public input in there. This is just a model which could be used in some instances. On the other hand, this is also a quite expensive model. So you also have to be look very, if you want to sustain those systems, how we are going to organize. And therefore, my suggestion to maybe related to a fee which is based on part of your DRG diagnosis, for instance. So the governance and funding is very crucial to actually bring it forward.
Thanks very much, Ben. I realize we've still got quite a few outstanding questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time at the moment, which leaves me really to thank my co-panelists, Nicholas, Per, Jan, and also Wim as well. Thanks also to TLV for hosting us here in Stockholm, and as well, thank you for the Vital Transformation team in helping to produce this as well. And thanks very much to everyone who's been listening and contributing, and wish you all a pleasant day. Thank you.